Hello. If you're here right now, thank you, truly. This space exists because someone like you decided to stay just a little longer, to listen, to imagine, to wander with me into a world where history bleeds between the lines. This video isn't about memorizing dates or idolizing statues. It's about what history left behind in the cracks, in the dust, the shadows, and sometimes in the blood. If at any point this story touches something in you, even softly, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a comment, not out of obligation, but only if it means something to you. That's enough. Now, take a breath, because what comes next is real enough to be terrifying and absurd enough to feel like fiction. Imagine a structure built with over 100,000 tons of stone, not to protect anyone, but to tear people apart. A place where 50,000 men, women, and children once packed themselves shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide, mouths open, not to watch a championship match, but to watch someone die. The Colosseum, the crown jewel of Roman architecture, and the loudest, bloodiest lie ever carved into stone. They said it was where the people found joy. What they didn't say was that every performance began with someone who already knew how it would end. There were 76 entrances, each leading to a fate, but only one led to the arena floor. That was the door no one walked back through. The ground was covered in sand, not for aesthetics, but because sand absorbed blood better than marble. The scent? A cocktail of rust, sweat, and something older. The smell of fear that had nowhere else to go. And when the crowd settled into their seats, when the emperor raised a casual hand from his shaded box, the games began. Not with fairness, not with balance, but with a decision already made. You see two men in the center. One is a legend, armor gleaming, sword with a name, muscles sculpted by years in the ludus. The other, a prisoner. Maybe a farmer who didn't pay his taxes. Maybe a foreigner who prayed to the wrong gods. His weapon? A tattered net, a bent trident. Sometimes not even that. And yet the crowd roars. Because this isn't about who wins. It's about how the loser falls. Justice here is a script. And every good story needs a villain. Today's villain is whoever the empire says deserves to die. And the hero is whoever makes them die beautifully. Imagine sitting there, somewhere in the upper seats. You're surrounded by bakers, senators, prostitutes, soldiers. Everyone is equal, at least for the next few hours, because everyone gets to watch someone else fall. And when that first blade strikes, you don't hear silence, you hear thunder, cheers, laughter, coins tossed in the air like confetti. The man in the sand stumbles, his leg gives out, blood blooms across his chest like a crimson flower, but he tries, oh, he tries, to fall with dignity. A final spin, a scream, a performance, because in the Colosseum, dying wasn't enough. You had to die well. If you stumbled, if you cried, if you begged, you were forgotten. But if you collapsed like a warrior, head high, even in your final breath, you might be remembered. A name scratched into a clay cup, a face painted in the corner of a tavern, a whispered story passed from mouth to mouth until the details fade and only the glory remains. But no one survives a story where they were only ever meant to be background. What's worse? Many gladiators weren't born fighters. They were trained to entertain, to fall gracefully, to die convincingly, because their real audience wasn't the emperor, it was the crowd, the people, the ones who demanded blood, not justice. And when a victor stood, panting under the Roman sun, sword dripping, he'd look up to the emperor's box, waiting. Would he live? Would he die? The crowd would shout. Thumbs turned, but no one really knew what gesture meant what. Was it thumb up for mercy? Thumb down for death? Horizontal? The truth is, it never mattered. The emperor did what he wanted. He always did. And even if the crowd begged for mercy, sometimes the blade still fell. Because mercy wasn't part of the ticket. You might be wondering, would I have cheered too? Would I, in that time, have sat among the crowd, my voice raised with theirs? Maybe. Maybe not. But don't judge them too quickly, because history has this cruel way of showing us that the monster on stage was never just the man with the sword. It was the applause. But not all deaths in the arena came with a sword. Some came with teeth, and those were the ones the crowd loved most. They called it damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to beasts. A sentence, yes, but also a performance, because nothing thrilled the Roman heart quite like watching flesh rip under the power of something untamed. This wasn't a fight. It was an offering, a public sacrifice, not to the gods, but to the empire's hunger for fear, for spectacle, for control. The condemned were rarely given weapons. Sometimes they were stripped bare. Sometimes they were dressed in ridiculous costumes. The skins of animals or tunics dyed like clowns. As if their last moments needed to be even more humiliating, they stood in the sand, blinking under the sun, their eyes searching the crowd for some sign of mercy, or God, or meaning. But all they saw were faces, rows upon rows of faces, some bored, some excited, some chewing olives, and then the gate would open, no horns, no drums, just the sound of chains clinking and claws dragging across stone, a lion, or a leopard, sometimes a bear, driven half-mad by weeks of starvation, sometimes several. The animals were not angry, they were hungry. And there is no dignity in being eaten alive by something that sees you only as meat. The crowd cheered, not for the man, but for the moment. The moment when human flesh met animal instinct, when blood arced through the air like fireworks, and the empire reminded everyone watching. This is what happens when you disobey. Some tried to run, some tried to scream. A few, in their last seconds, dropped to their knees and prayed, not for salvation, but for it to be quick. But nothing was quick, not in the Colosseum. Pain had to last, terror had to echo, and the crowd, they needed time to feel entertained. Do you think people cried? Some did, quietly, mostly the ones sitting too far back to see well. But the ones in front, the elites, the senators, the men who wrote laws with one hand and threw criminals to beasts with the other, they leaned forward. They pointed. They laughed. They placed bets. This one will scream longer. No, that one, look at how he runs. He'll trip. Justice? There was no justice here. Only a message. Obey. Or be devoured. It wasn't always criminals. Sometimes it was Christians. Sometimes it was prisoners of war. Sometimes it was just inconvenient people. And the beasts, they were just tools. Their claws were the empire's teeth. Their hunger, Rome's voice. Do you know how the crowd knew the show was over? Not when the man stopped moving, but when the lion did. Sometimes, after the kill, the animal would pace around the body, unsure. It had eaten, yes, but it wasn't satisfied, because even the beast could sense the rot in what had just happened. And then, from above, a horn would sound. Slaves would rush out, dragging the body by the limbs. The sand would be raked, the blood covered with fresh dirt, as if it hadn't happened, as if the arena was clean again, ready for the next one. It always was. This is what made the Colosseum holy, in a twisted way. It wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of erasure, a theater of forgetting. Because Rome didn't just kill, it consumed, it rewrote, it made murder into memory, and memory into myth. And if you think that's too cruel to be real, remember this. No civilization ever called itself a monster. They all believed they were building order, even when that order wore a lion's mouth. But Rome was never satisfied with just blood. It wanted theater. It wanted chaos dressed as ceremony. It wanted to remind the world that no force, not even nature itself, could defy the empire. So they brought the jungle to the city. They called it Venatio, the hunt. But it wasn't a hunt in the way the forest knew it. It was a spectacle, a carefully staged nightmare. And for that, they turned the Colosseum into something new. The floor, once stained with blood and sand, was covered in elaborate scenery, trees, rocks, even flowing streams. Painted backdrops mimicked distant deserts, thick African brush, or the lush banks of the Nile. The arena became the world, or at least Rome's version of it. And into that world, they unleashed hell. Leopards, ostriches, bears, rhinos, crocodiles. Some were led in with chains. Others were shot out of trapdoors, exploding into the light like living weapons. No one in the crowd knew exactly what was coming. That was the thrill. One moment, silence. The next, chaos. An ostrich darting across the arena, absurd and furious. A panther leaping into the air, landing on a fake rock with the grace of poetry and the promise of death. A bear swiping blindly at a tree that wasn't real. A crocodile dragged into sunlight, blind and furious, its tail whipping like a storm across the sand. And standing there, in the middle of it all, the bestiarii, the beast fighters. Not all of them were trained. Some were criminals, given a choice: die screaming or die with a spear in your hand. Some were veterans, too broken for war but still useful for a crowd. Some were volunteers, men who wanted glory, men who wanted to die seen. They wore armor, yes, but it didn't matter. No armor saves you from a lion that doesn't care where your bones bend. And yet, the crowd adored it. When a man lunged at a leopard and missed, they laughed. When an ostrich kicked a fighter square in the chest and sent him flying, they roared. When a crocodile dragged someone under a pile of fake leaves and the sand turned red, they cheered. Because it wasn't just a fight. It was comedy. It was adventure. It was proof that Rome could tame even the wildest beasts. Even if those beasts sometimes won. There were moments of madness. A rhino, confused by the lights, charged the stands. A bear climbed a set peace tree and refused to come down. A bull, painted gold for a festival, crushed two handlers before anyone noticed. But no one left. No one turned away. Because this was what they paid for. Not perfection, but unpredictability. It was the empire's favorite lie, that even nature bowed to its will. Behind the scenes, dozens of slaves worked to keep the illusion alive. They cleaned the blood, dragged out the bodies, both human and animal, and reset the stage. Sometimes, the same leopard was used in 3 different shows, dyed 3 different colors. Sometimes, they'd stitch wounds between events, just to keep the animal presentable. It didn't matter if it suffered. Suffering wasn't a flaw. It was the point. And when the day ended, and the crowd spilled back into the streets, faces flushed, stomachs full, minds buzzing, they didn't remember names. They didn't mourn the dead. They remembered the moment the ostrich kicked, the way the bear stood on its hind legs, the sound of a sword slicing air, missing its mark. They remembered the thrill of the hunt, even if no one was really hunting. Because in the Colosseum, nothing was wild. Not the animals, not the men, not even death. Everything was part of the act. Everything was for them. There's something especially cruel about turning a myth into a death sentence. Rome understood that cruelty and elevated it into art. Because what's more thrilling than a man being punished? A man being punished beautifully. They called it theater. But it wasn't acting. It was reenactment. And in the Colosseum, reenactments were never just symbolic. They were literal. They were final. Imagine this. You're sitting in your seat, your fingers still greasy from the street food sold outside. The crowd is restless, not from boredom, but from anticipation. A trumpet sounds, the curtains part, and there he is, a man with wax wings, arms outstretched, dressed like a child's drawing of Icarus. Behind him, a set of scaffolding has been rigged to look like the sky. Beneath him, a pit of fire. You already know how this story ends, but that doesn't stop you from watching. He climbs. Each step is unsteady, not from nerves, but because the platform is barely stable. Someone shouts something vulgar from the crowd. Laughter erupts. He reaches the top. He hesitates. And then he jumps. The wings don't catch him. They were never meant to. They crumble. They melt. They fold in. He hits the flames. And for one brilliant moment, everyone believes they've seen Icarus fall. Later, someone will say the scream was part of the performance, that the man was trained, that it was quick, but it wasn't, because Roman myth demanded authenticity, and authenticity demanded a body. It didn't stop there. Another day, another myth. This time, Prometheus. You know the story. The man who stole fire from the gods, punished by having his liver eaten day after day by a bird. The Roman version was simpler. They chained a man to a rock in the center of the arena, and then released a trained eagle. The bird didn't know myth. It only knew pain. It pecked. It tore. It fed. The man screamed. And the crowd adored it. There were reenactments of Orpheus, too. A musician trying to charm the underworld. He'd sing in the arena, voice trembling, lyre shaking in his hands. They'd release wild animals from hidden gates. If he played well, maybe they'd hesitate. If not, well, there's always tomorrow's show. You might think, surely people knew this was wrong. But wrong wasn't the point. The point was wonder. The point was awe. The Romans believed they were honoring the gods, or mocking them, or testing them. It didn't matter, because every story told this way became part of Rome's truth. They weren't just watching myths. They were rewriting them in real blood, on real sand, with real screams echoing off the marble. The actors were slaves, criminals, foreigners. But for a brief moment, they became gods, fallen ones, burned, broken, consumed. The crowd watched, transfixed, not because they were evil, but because they had forgotten the difference between story and sentence, between legend and law, between theater and execution. This was the genius of the arena. It didn't hide death. It dressed it up, gave it costume, choreography, and a moral. And once you believe death is part of the story, you stop feeling it. But if blood in the sand began to feel too familiar, Rome had another trick. They drowned the Colosseum. Yes, they flooded it. Because nothing was ever too excessive. And if men dying on land became mundane, why not make them die at sea? They called it naumachia, mock sea battles, a theater of drowning, a war with no escape. To do it, they engineered systems beneath the arena, channels, reservoirs, valves carved by thousands of nameless workers, a miracle of hydraulics, a monument to obsession. With the right mechanism, they could flood the floor within minutes. The dry desert stone transformed into a shimmering blue mirror, at least for a little while. And once the water rose high enough, they brought out the ships, small flat-bottomed vessels, designed not for war, but for drama, sometimes replicas of real triremes, sometimes mythical. painted like dragons or serpents, bright and absurd. But the men inside them were real. They were prisoners, condemned criminals, war captives. Their punishment? To play soldier, to reenact famous battles, real or imagined, and to die convincingly. They were given paddles. Some were armed, some weren't. Sometimes they were trained. Sometimes they weren't even told how to swim. The horns sounded, the ships launched, and chaos began. Arrows whistled. Javelins pierced wood and flesh alike. Some vessels collided. Others capsized. The crowd, tens of thousands of people, screamed in delight as men clawed at the water's surface, gasping, fighting to stay afloat. Some clung to broken planks. Others tried to hide beneath wreckage. But there was no hiding in the Colosseum, and no mercy. Because this wasn't a battle, it was a script. And the script demanded they die. When a ship sank, the audience roared. When a man drowned, they clapped. When someone tried to climb aboard an enemy boat to survive, the crowd booed. They didn't want cleverness. They wanted choreography. They wanted blood in waves. And sometimes, just to raise the stakes, they added animals, crocodiles, sea lions, even hippos, confused and furious, smashing through boats with prehistoric power. You might wonder, how did the water stay clean? It didn't. It turned red, then brown, then thick. And when the show was over, slaves had to drain the whole thing, haul out the bodies, scrub the stone, so that tomorrow they could do it again. These battles weren't annual events. They weren't sacred. They were filler, lunch entertainment, a sideshow before the main acts. But they were expensive, and brutal, and complicated. And that's exactly why Rome loved them, because nothing said power like turning a desert into an ocean, and then filling that ocean with bodies. They say Augustus once held a naumachia with 3,000 men, all dead, all forgotten. But the crowd remembered the spectacle. They remembered the splash, the scream, the sinking hand, just visible before it vanished below the surface. Rome was a city of engineering marvels, but its greatest invention wasn't aqueducts or roads or architecture. It was cruelty, disguised as celebration. But not every fight in the arena was about power. Some were about humiliation, because after the blood, the beasts, and the battles, the crowd craved something new, not bigger, not louder, just stranger. And so the games evolved into farce, into comedy, into something darker than death itself. They called them ludi absurdi, the absurd games. Imagine a man, not a warrior, not even a criminal, standing in the middle of the arena, his eyes covered with cloth, his hands bound. In one fist, a wooden stick. In the other, nothing. Across from him, another just like him, blindfolded, stumbling, swinging at air. They couldn't see. They couldn't hear over the roar. They didn't even know where each other stood. They just moved, blind, clumsy, desperate. The crowd howled with laughter. Every missed swing, every trip over a sandal, every time one man smacked himself in the face by accident, they roared. This wasn't about killing. It was about mocking, a slapstick ballet of bruises and confusion. And when, eventually, one man landed a lucky blow and the other fell to the ground, the victor raised his useless stick into the air like a hero. He wasn't a hero. He was a joke who survived. Sometimes they added more players. 12 men, all blindfolded. A ring of fire around the arena. The last one standing was declared the champion. Sometimes they gave them absurd weapons, a feather, a flute, a frying pan, or worse, a real weapon, but no chance to use it. One time, a man was given a trident. His opponent got a net, just like the classic gladiator matchup, except the trident was made of wax. It melted in his hands before he even got close. Another time, they unleashed a goat into the arena and tied stakes to the backs of the fighters. The goat chased them. The men chased each other. The crowd wept with joy. It was ridiculous, but that was the point. Because after watching real death all morning, the audience needed a break. They needed laughter to rinse the taste of blood. And what better way to laugh than at someone else's pain? There were games where the fighters wore bells, and the goal was to sneak up silently on your opponent. There were matches held in complete silence, the audience sworn to hush, where any sound gave you away. And when someone screamed from a stubbed toe or a misstep, they laughed even louder. This wasn't sport, it was ritualized humiliation. And sometimes it was scripted. Rome knew that not everyone died gracefully, so it taught them how to die entertainingly. They trained prisoners how to fall, how to scream just enough, how to die with flair, not flailing. A good death could earn applause. A great death might even earn a second chance. But a boring death? That was unforgivable. The emperor himself sometimes decided if a man had performed well enough to live, not fought well, performed. Because in the end, the Colosseum wasn't about justice, or warfare, or even glory. It was a stage, and the best actors didn't always wear masks. They wore scars. They wore shame. They wore the weight of 1,000 eyes watching and judging and laughing. If you ever wonder how a man could stand in front of 50,000 people with a spoon in one hand and a blindfold over his face, the answer is simple. Because it was either that or die quietly in a cell where no one would ever know your name. At least here, for one afternoon, you were somebody, even if it was just as a fool. You might imagine that after hours of chaos, lions leaping, ships sinking, blind men swinging spoons, the Roman crowd would need a break, a moment of peace, a quiet lunch, and they did. They called it meridiani, the midday pause, but in the Colosseum, nothing ever really paused, because in Rome, even lunch came with a show. While the spectators unwrapped figs and bread, sipped watered wine or chewed on dates, the arena floor was quietly swept clean. Slaves dragged away what remained from the morning spectacles. The scent of blood, still fresh in the sun, mingled with rosemary and roast meat. Then came the real main course. The executions. No costumes. No theater. No mercy. This part wasn't about spectacle. It was about certainty. These were the condemned, the guilty, or at least the accused. Some had stolen, some had rebelled, some had simply been inconvenient. And now, they were part of the day's programming, scheduled between the comedy and the climax. They were marched out in silence, hands bound, often naked, sometimes gagged. Not to fight, not to run, just to be ended. A single sword, a single swing. One man held the blade. Another knelt beside him. The crowd barely looked up from their bread. A dull thud. A pause. A cheer. And then, the next. It was routine. Clean. Almost efficient. Not always, though. Some were burned. Some were crucified on tiny makeshift crosses, lifted just high enough for the front row to see. Some were forced to kill each other for the promise that one might be spared, a promise rarely kept. There was no pretense of justice, no gods invoked, no trials replayed. This was not about guilt. It was about timing, blood before dessert. Children watched. Women gossiped. Vendors shouted over the screams, selling honey cakes and lamb skewers. And no one seemed to notice the contradiction. Or if they did, they'd long made peace with it. Because in Rome, death wasn't a sacred thing. It was a convenience, a punctuation mark in the day. A man could die just as you bit into a plum. Another might bleed out while someone passed around olives. The executions served a purpose, though, a subtle one. They reminded everyone watching that power didn't need a reason, that the state could end a life not with rage, but with rhythm, right on time, between bites. It was a message carved in the silence between applause, and sometimes, just sometimes, the condemned would speak, a final word, a curse, a scream of innocence that pierced through the normal noise like a splinter in the mind. Those were the moments that lingered, the ones that haunted, but only for a while. By the afternoon, the next act had begun, and the crowd, re-energized by both food and death, cheered with renewed delight, ready for whatever came next. You'd think life and death should belong to gods, or emperors, or at least someone with a name, but in the Colosseum, sometimes it belonged to you, to your hand, to your thumb, to a single, thoughtless gesture. Because in Rome, the crowd didn't just watch the show, they were part of it. When the fight was over, when two men had danced their brutal ballet in blood and exhaustion, when one stood wheezing above the other, sword pressed gently to a heaving chest, everything paused, and all eyes turned to the audience. The victor would look up, eyes wide with sweat and sand. The vanquished, bleeding, broken, yet somehow still breathing, would lie at his feet, and the arena would go silent, waiting, not for the gods, not for the emperor, but for the crowd. Because this moment was democracy in its most twisted form. The thumb decided. A turn of the wrist, an upward flick, a downward push. But here's the cruel joke of it all. No one actually agrees what the thumb meant. Modern films will tell you thumbs down meant death. But some scholars argue the opposite, that a raised thumb was the blade, the spear, the kill. Others say it wasn't the direction, but the motion. Some even claim it wasn't a thumb at all, just a shout, a chant, a wave of hands. So imagine that. Imagine dying because someone misunderstood a signal. You look up, hoping for mercy, and see a sea of arms, some lifted high, others pointing down, some just flailing in excitement. The emperor shrugs. The victor glances around, and then he acts. Because hesitation is weakness, and weakness has no place in Rome. If you're lucky, it's quick. If you're not, it's a mess. Either way, the crowd cheers. They got what they wanted. But what did they want? Did they crave justice? Did they weigh valor? Did they think at all? Or did they just react? Like children at a puppet show, booing the villain and clapping for the hero. Truth is, most of them didn't know the names of the men fighting, didn't know their crimes, or whether they had any, didn't care. What they knew was the thrill, the rhythm, the pulse of having a say, even if they never felt heard outside these walls. Here, they had power, and they used it like a toy. Sometimes, the crowd was merciful, moved by a wounded man's courage, touched by a moment of grace, but other times, they were hungry, not for food, for finality, and there was no appeal, no argument, no delay. Once the hand moved, so did the blade. This wasn't justice. It was crowdsourced execution, a flash poll of death. And yet, it felt normal. Because when something happens often enough, even the grotesque becomes tradition. So they kept doing it. For decades. For centuries. Men died because strangers gestured. Because a thumb flicked. Because a crowd felt like it. And those who lived? They walked off the sand knowing they'd please the mob. For now. But the crowd is fickle. It forgets. It turns. And next time, the thumb might turn. With it, of all the beasts that thundered through the Colosseum, lions with bloodied manes, elephants with painted tusks, crocodiles dragged from the Nile, none held the chaotic magic of a wild boar. They weren't majestic like tigers. They weren't monstrous like bears. They weren't even supposed to be frightening, but they were fast, unpredictable, and worst of all, hilarious. The Romans never intended them to be stars. At first they were filler, tossed in during venations, the morning animal hunts. Some poor soul, armed with a flimsy spear and even flimsier training, would be told to entertain the crowd by cornering one of these squealing, tusked nightmares. But a 300-pound ball of muscle and rage doesn't follow scripts. It charges. And it doesn't care if you're a gladiator, a prisoner, or a senator who got too close to the edge of the arena. The crowd loved it. Not because of the danger, but because of the comedy. The way a grown man would leap, shriek, or tumble backwards when a boar came barreling out of a hidden trapdoor. The way two armed fighters would suddenly forget their duel and sprint in opposite directions to avoid the angry pig in the middle. The way the arena, designed for noble violence and elegant death, turned into a slapstick circus the moment that beast hit the sand. Some shows began to use them intentionally, not as threats, but as punchlines. They'd be painted with stripes like tigers, dressed in absurd armor, or once reportedly fitted with golden tusks, because why not? A whisper spread through the crowd before each match. Is there a boar today? Because that meant something might go terribly wrong, and therefore wonderfully right. There are records of a match where two gladiators fought to a standstill. A beautiful, brutal dance of skill. The audience grew quiet, entranced, moved even, and then, out of nowhere, a boar burst out of the floor and knocked both men flat with a single, thunderous charge. The crowd erupted, not for the fighters, for the pig. Children screamed with delight. Vendors dropped trays of olives. Even the emperor was said to have laughed. And that was the problem. Because once a joke works, Rome never lets it go. Soon, the boars weren't accidents. They were scheduled. Some appeared mid-battle. Some were tied to criminals and let loose to choose their prey. Some were painted in ridiculous colors and set loose just to chase terrified, unarmed men around the arena like a living cartoon. The line between hunter and clown blurred, and the beast in the middle became the star. Imagine being a trained warrior. You've fought to survive. You've killed with honor. And suddenly, you're running in circles because an animal no one respects might break your leg. There were days when more people talked about the boar than the champions. Did you see that guy get launched into the air like a rag doll? Did you see the way it knocked down 3 men with one swing of its head? It became legend. Some even claimed the same boar appeared again and again, spared by the emperor because he was too entertaining to die. They called him by names: Porcus Rex, the Tuscan comedian, the emperor's favorite. Of course, it was likely many different animals. Boars don't live long in blood-soaked theaters. But the myth outlived them. Because in the Colosseum, sometimes the crowd didn't need a hero or a villain, just something unexpected. And nothing says chaos quite like a beast that isn't trying to kill you, just trying to get through the noise, the lights, the pain, and maybe, accidentally, bowl over a centurion or two along the way. It was absurd. It was Rome, a place where power was a game, where blood was a joke. And sometimes, the pig got the final laugh. You've survived the blades. You've dodged the claws. You've pleased the crowd. You think you know the rules. But in the Colosseum, the rules shift beneath your feet, literally. Because the arena floor was not just sand and blood, it was a trap. Beneath that golden dust lay one of the most terrifying innovations in Roman entertainment, the Hippodrome, an underground maze of chambers, tunnels, elevators, and trapdoors, all hidden just below the surface. From up top, the sand looked solid, trustworthy, but one wrong step, and the earth itself betrayed you. You see, the Colosseum wasn't just a theater, it was a machine, and it had teeth, dozens, maybe hundreds, of trapdoors scattered across the floor, each one connected to a pulley, a counterweight, a team of sweating slaves in the darkness. With a single signal, they could launch a beast from below. Not walk it, launch it. One moment, you're fighting a man with a trident. The next, the floor cracks open, and a leopard erupts from the earth like a ghost on fire. Or worse, it wasn't a beast. It was fire. They rigged flame traps beneath the sand. Oil-soaked straw, smoke bombs. Sparks timed to ignite the moment you stepped on the wrong square. The floor became a battlefield, but it was also a stage. And stages are made for surprises. Even the sand itself could betray you. Some spots were softer, placed to trip. Others were laced with hidden wires to pull away shields. Some platforms were unstable, rigged to collapse beneath your weight. Fighters began to memorize the floor like chessboards. They practiced not just their strikes, but their steps. Because one misstep didn't just mean failure, it meant humiliation. Imagine the crowd's laughter as a warrior, proud and poised, suddenly disappeared through the floor like a magician's rabbit, only to reappear moments later, tangled in rope, face covered in ash, beast snarling beside him. The Colosseum made death theatrical, but it also made it unpredictable. Even veterans, seasoned gladiators who'd won a dozen matches, feared the trapdoors, not because of what they held, but because of what they didn't know. A lion? A bear? Nothing at all? Sometimes the door would creak open and remain empty. Just a gap, a pause, a silence. Enough to break a fighter's rhythm, enough to make him hesitate, and in hesitation, someone else's sword found its mark. It wasn't just about danger, it was about timing. Surprise wasn't an accident, it was engineered, scripted, perfectly placed to draw screams, gasps, cheers. Some say the trapdoor system was so complex that certain operators, slaves who lived in the tunnels, had memorized entire fight choreographies. They knew when to raise the tiger, when to release the smoke, when to let the silence breathe, just long enough to make the next death feel new. They weren't just technicians, they were composers. Down in the dark, pulling ropes and pushing cages, they played the arena like an instrument, and the music was fear. For the men above, every square of sand could be the last. Every fight could be interrupted. Every duel could become a three-way struggle with an animal or fire or collapsing stone. It turned warriors into dancers, men into marionettes, and all of it, every trap, every scream, every twist, served one purpose: to keep the crowd guessing. Because once they expected death, the only way to thrill them was to make death arrive from below. By now, you might think the arena was all chaos, that every fight was raw, every death unplanned, every victory a miracle carved from sweat and steel, but that's not how empires work, not Rome. Because Rome loved control, and behind the illusion of randomness was choreography. Enter the gladiator celebrity. Not every fighter in the Colosseum was there to die. Some were there to win. Again, and again, and again. Not because they were invincible, though many fought like gods, but because they were valuable. A crowd favorite meant full seats. A known name meant sold-out amphory of wine. A champion's face carved into dice, oil lamps, children's toys. And that kind of popularity? Well, it had to be protected. So sometimes, not always but often enough, the match was decided long before the swords clashed. Imagine it. A newcomer, barely trained, barely fed, barely more than a name scratched onto a roster, thrown into the sunlit sand. Across from him, a legend. The crowd already knows who will win. They've brought scrolls with his image. They chant his nickname before the gates even open. The rookie's knees tremble, not from fear, but from irrelevance. Because today's not about him. It's about preserving the brand. So maybe his blade is dulled. Maybe his shield is smaller. Maybe he's instructed to fall just right, not too early, not too late, just enough to make the star look glorious. The crowd roars. The veteran raises his arms, and somewhere, coins exchange hands in the stands above. But here's the twist. Nobody feels cheated. Because Rome doesn't want truth. Rome wants the feeling of truth, the illusion, the theater, the narrative, a legend rising, a villain crushed, an underdog humbled. It was wrestling before wrestling, scripted violence, orchestrated blood, and the audience ate it up. Because deep down, they knew. They weren't stupid. They saw the mismatches, the convenient stumbles, the wounds that looked a bit too clean. But they didn't come for fairness. They came to feel something, to weep for a fall, to cheer for a triumph, to gasp at a comeback that had been rehearsed a dozen times in secret. And the fighters? Well, they played their roles. Some gritted their teeth and accepted it, because losing publicly might buy them time privately. Others rebelled, throwing a match off script, landing a blow they weren't supposed to, dying for real when they were meant to survive. And some, the stars, they basked in it. They knew how to stand, how to fall, how to bleed just the right amount to draw applause. They had fans, followers, merchandise. They were Rome's action figures, but with real broken bones. Some gladiators even had agents, trainers who negotiated matchups, ensured armor wasn't sabotaged, demanded a dramatic ending that favored the client's image. It sounds ridiculous, but so does painting pigs gold and throwing them at criminals. Rome was absurd. Rome was brutal. Rome was brutally theatrical, and the Colosseum was its stage. Every fight told a story, but not every story was true. And in the end, did it matter? Not to the crowd, not to the empire, not to the sands that soaked it all in. Because the roar was real, the blood was real, and the fame, oh, the fame was everything. By now, you know the blood was real. The screams, the swords, the spectacle. But behind it all, behind every lion's roar, every staged death, every thunderous applause, was something far more calculated. The Colosseum wasn't built just for fun. It was built for power. You see, the emperors of Rome didn't just want to be obeyed. They wanted to be believed, worshipped, feared. And what better way to do it than by throwing open the gates of a giant stone mouth and letting it speak for them? Because make no mistake, the Colosseum was a mouth, and every drop of blood it spilled was a message. When the empire faced unrest, they gave the people games, weeks of them. Because if your belly's full of wine and your eyes are full of violence, you forget the taxes, you forget the corruption, you forget the famine eating your street. You cheer, you scream, you bow to the emperor who gave it all to you. Bread and circuses, they called it. But the bread was stale, and the circus, it was soaked in propaganda. Emperors sat high above in gilded boxes, not hidden, displayed, bathed in light, wreathed in laurels, the gods among mortals. And each time a beast fell, a criminal was torn apart, a hero rose victorious. The crowd looked up. To him, the provider, the puppet master, he didn't need to say a word. The arena said it for him. Rome is strong. Rome is merciful. Rome decides who lives and who doesn't. But Rome was just a name. It was he who decided. The Colosseum became a sermon in stone. Every match a metaphor. Every death a parable. When a rebellious province needed to be reminded who was in charge, They staged a play where the rebel, dressed in foreign garb, was defeated by a noble Roman fighter. When a scandal rocked the Senate, they flooded the arena and staged a glorious naval battle, so large, so loud, that gossip drowned in waves of spectacle. When the emperor's image needed polishing, he mercifully spared a beaten gladiator. The crowd wept. Songs were written. It didn't matter that the man would be quietly executed the next day. In that moment, the emperor looked like a god. Even architecture whispered power. The seats were divided by class, the rich in stone comfort, the poor in wooden rows, foreigners in the back, women in their own section, reminded at every turn who held the leash. But it didn't feel like tyranny, not with so much noise, so much thrill, so much gratitude. Because when the emperor gave you games, he wasn't just entertaining you. He was distracting you, training you, reminding you, with every blade and every cheer, that your life, like the fighters, was at his mercy. And the irony? The people loved him for it. They screamed his name, built temples to his image, and waited all year for the next festival of blood. The Colosseum was never just a place to kill. It was a place to teach, not with words, but with noise, with ritual, with silence before the final blow. Because when the crowd gasped, when 50,000 hearts beat in perfect rhythm, when the sand turned red and no one looked away, the emperor smiled, not because he enjoyed death, but because he had turned it into worship. They say fire destroys, but before it destroys, it purifies. Long before matches, gasoline, or lighters, humans huddled around flickering flames like moths to meaning. Because fire wasn't just a tool, it was a bridge between this world and something greater. Let's begin in the forest of the Celts, in the mist-thick lands of ancient Ireland and Scotland. No Roman marble, no grand stone temples, just earth, sky, and the fire between them. And once a year, when the veil between worlds thinned, they lit the fire of Beltane. It wasn't just a bonfire, it was the fire. Villagers gathered at the edge of winter and spring, when the crops were in danger, when sickness still lingered in the bones, to invite the gods back into their fields and flesh. 2 great fires were lit, tall as the trees. Cattle were driven between them. People walked beside the flames. Some leapt through the smoke. Because this wasn't about warmth, it was about cleansing. The fire burned off the past, sickness, evil spirits, even bad luck. You didn't just stand by it, you passed through it. And if you were brave or desperate, you whispered names into the smoke, the names of lovers, ancestors, enemies, and let the fire decide what should stay and what should vanish. Ashes were smeared on faces. Coals were taken home to relight hearths, as if saying, "Let this new fire burn away the rot of the old year." But this wasn't just ritual, it was power, because those who lit the flame became its guardians. And in that society where nature ruled and gods whispered in the trees, those who touched the flame first held the ears of the divine, now cross the world, leave the green hills behind, and descend into the golden, sacred lands of Persia. Here, fire was not just divine, it was the divine. Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest organized religions on earth, placed fire not just at the altar, but at the center of all things. They called it Atar, the sacred flame. Not a god, but a messenger. It wasn't fire for cooking, or burning witches, or making weapons. It was the fire that listened, that remembered, that carried your prayers upward like smoke to the stars. Temples were built around it. Priests, Athravans, kept it burning, uninterrupted, sometimes for centuries. Even today, some fire temples in Iran and India have flames that haven't gone out in over 1,000 years. Think about that. A single flame, federal, protected, guarded, through war, famine, empire, invasion. Because to let it die was to let the link to the sacred break. Fire in Zoroastrianism was the visible symbol of truth, of Asha, cosmic order. It could not lie. It could not hide. And so, a man would place his hand over the flame and swear an oath, because if he lied, the fire would know. Fire didn't just purify the body, it purified the soul. In funeral rites, the body was never burned. That would defile the fire. Instead, corpses were placed in high towers to be claimed by vultures, while the fire remained untouched, sacred, pure. Because the divine wasn't found in destruction, but in endurance. And just like the Celts, the Zoroastrians believed that fire was a portal, not to burn the past, but to illuminate the path forward. It lit the stories of heroes. It revealed the true hearts of men. It stood between lies and justice, between flesh and spirit. Two worlds, two peoples, two different flames. One ignited to chase out darkness, one preserved to protect truth. But in both, fire was never just fire. It was memory. It was promise. It was a whisper of something bigger than us, burning just long enough for us to remember what it means to be human. Not all flames are meant to stay still. Some are born to move, to run, to carry meaning across mountains, across cities, across centuries. Welcome to ancient Greece, a place where gods played politics, heroes bled into legend, and fire ran faster than men. In the world of the Hellenes, fire had always belonged to the divine. Prometheus stole it from the gods to give it to mortals, and for that he was chained to a rock, his liver devoured by an eagle each day, a punishment for bringing light to the dark. But what was once theft became tradition, and eventually became honor. The torch relay, Lampidodromia, wasn't born with the Olympics. It came earlier, as a religious ritual. Young men, chosen for their speed and devotion, lined up in the city streets, each one holding a torch lit from the sacred flame. And the rule was simple: don't let it die. This wasn't a race against each other. It was a race against the wind, against time, against failure. The torch didn't just represent a message. It was the message. If the flame went out, the gods might turn their faces. The ceremony might be cursed. The whole city might suffer. So they ran, hard, through narrow streets, barefoot on stone, lungs burning with the same fire they carried in their hands. They passed it, hand to hand, like a secret, like a prayer. Crowds cheered, not for the fastest, but for the faithful. Because this wasn't about who won. It was about who preserved the flame. And when it reached the altar, still burning, still alive, the whole city exhaled. A sign, a symbol, a blessing. Later, this ritual would become tied to the Olympics, a ceremony that drew cities together not through politics or conquest, but through shared awe. The torch became a banner of peace, a signal that war was paused, a reminder that no matter how divided the world was, this flame belonged to everyone. In modern times, we still watch it, carried across continents, pass between hands, run through storm and snow and chaos. And we feel something stir, because it's not just about the fire. It's about the fact that it's still burning. From a temple in Olympia to a stadium in Tokyo or Rio, from the hand of a child to the hand of a champion, this flame has outrun time itself. But make no mistake, in ancient Greece, carrying that torch wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about sport. It was about devotion. And if your hand trembled, if the wind got the better of you, if the flame died, you didn't just disappoint your city, you disappointed the gods. So imagine that pressure, a teenager, breathless, heart pounding, knowing that what he held wasn't just fire, but expectation, that he was not a runner, but a bridge between mortals and the divine, between what burns and what never must go out. Some gods roar, some strike, some rule from above, but some, they listen. In the vast and intricate world of Hinduism, a world of gods, chants, stars, rivers, elephants, avatars, there is one presence that appears in nearly every ritual, not always as a figure, but as a flame. His name is Agni, and he is fire. Not fire as destruction, not fire as spectacle, but fire as a messenger, a sacred conduit between the seen and the unseen. Agni does not speak. He receives. He sits at the center of every yajna, the sacred fire offering. And in the oldest Sanskrit hymns, the Rigveda, he is the very first god praised. The verse doesn't ask for favor, it simply acknowledges, Agni, I invoke you, first among the gods. Because without him, no prayer could be heard, no vow could be trusted, no spirit could cross. Agni is not the goal, he is the pathway. When a family gathers for a wedding in India, Agni burns in the center, not as decoration but as witness. The bride and groom walk around the flame 7 times. The Saptapadi, each step a promise, not whispered to each other, but spoken in front of Agni. Because once the fire hears it, it cannot be taken back. The flame becomes law. The glow becomes a seal. In funerals, too, Agni is there, not to devour the dead, but to carry them forward. Cremation in Hindu tradition is not destruction, it is transformation. The body, having served its purpose, is offered into the flames. And Agni, as guardian of the worlds, lifts the soul through fire into the next chapter of its journey. And so, the smoke that rises from a pyre is not just carbon and ash, it is spirit in motion. And yet, Agni isn't a distant god. He is not unreachable. He is the warmth of the kitchen hearth, the flicker in a temple lamp, the dancing light of Diya during Diwali, the festival of light where whole cities blaze in his honor. Children hold candles. Elders light rows of flame to welcome prosperity and cast out darkness. And Agni is present in each wick, glowing quietly, listening. In ancient times, Vedic priests would tend the sacred fire like a heartbeat, wood carefully chosen, ghee poured slowly, mantras spoken with precision. Each act, not habit but conversation. Because Agni is not a fire to fear, he is a fire to trust. He's the one who keeps your secrets, delivers your prayers, holds your oath in his flickering fingers until it becomes something more than words. In war, kings swore before Agni. In peace, treaties were sealed with flame, and it was believed, if you lied to Agni, his fire might not burn you today, but your lie would linger in the smoke, and someday the fire would remember. Because fire, in Hindu belief, doesn't just consume, it remembers, it records, it reflects. Agni is one of the rare gods who touches every stage of life, birth, naming, marriage, death. He is there, not judging, not ruling, but always present, always watching. And even now, thousands of years later, in villages and skyscrapers, temples and one-room homes, Agni burns, on altars, in corners, beside photographs, a soft flame dancing to ancient chants and everyday hopes. He doesn't ask for worship, only truth. Because Agni does not promise miracles. He only promises to carry your voice from this world to the next. There are places in the world where the sun is not just a source of light, it is God. And in the land of the Nile, where deserts shimmer like gold and tombs reach toward eternity, the sun did not rise. He sailed. His name was Ra. Ra, the sun god, the one-eyed traveler of the sky. the one who rode the celestial bark across the heavens by day and through the underworld by night. And what propelled this god? What burned beneath his chariot and lit up both the mortal world and the divine? Fire. Not ordinary fire, but the golden fire of life. In Egyptian belief, fire wasn't merely heat or destruction, it was breath, the very essence of gods. To breathe was to live. And when Ra exhaled, his breath became light. The world awakened, the crops grew, the temples glowed. But when his breath stilled, darkness returned. And with it, the need for guardians. That's where Sekhmet comes in, the lioness goddess, the eye of Ra, the flame of wrath. When mortals disobeyed the gods, when chaos threatened Maat, the divine balance, Ra sent Sekhmet, not as a warning, as a purge. With fire in her breath and vengeance in her roar, she swept through the land, burning the wicked from the earth until even Ra grew afraid. To stop her, they tricked her. They poured red beer across the land, a lake of illusion that mirrored blood. She drank, thinking it was her victory, and she slept. But the fire never died. It only went quiet. In the temples, priests lit sacred fires in her name, flames that could both heal and destroy. Sekhmet was not evil. She was balance with claws. In funerary rituals, fire returned again, this time in silence. When a soul passed into the afterlife, the journey wasn't instant. It was perilous, filled with traps, gates, judges, and monsters. And so, they were guided by spells, by prayers, by fire. The Book of the Dead wasn't a single book, but a collection of instructions. Incantations to help the deceased navigate the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. And in many of these texts, the soul is led by light, by flames conjured through magic and divine will. Fire illuminated the path. It revealed truth. It burned lies away. In tombs, small lamps were left burning beside the sarcophagus, not as decoration, as torches for the soul, so they wouldn't be lost, so they wouldn't fear, because the dead in Egypt were not gone. They were travelers, and fire was their compass. Even the great pyramids were aligned to the sun, to Ra's daily voyage, so that the pharaoh, entombed in stone, might rise again with the dawn. And when a priest lit a flame in a dark temple chamber, he wasn't just creating light. He was calling Ra. He was speaking in fire. The incense smoke that curled upward, that was breath too. Offerings, thoughts, requests, rising into the sky to join the eternal flame above. Even today, when you walk through ancient ruins in Egypt, you feel it. Not heat, but memory. The walls echo with sun-born shadows. The stones whisper of gods who breathed fire and watched your heart being weighed against a feather. And in that sacred stillness you understand. In Egypt, fire wasn't punishment. It was presence. A god's breath. A soul's lantern. A guide across forever. There are moments in history when a flame is not just a flame. It is a heartbeat, a prayer, a gamble with the cosmos. In the highlands of Mesoamerica, beneath the jagged shadows of volcanoes and pyramids that scrape the sky, the Aztecs gathered once every 52 years for a ritual unlike any other. They called it the New Fire Ceremony, and in it, they believed one terrifying truth. If the gods were displeased, if the ritual failed, the sun would never rise again. You see, time for the Aztecs was not a straight line. It was a cycle, a spinning wheel of creation, destruction, and rebirth. Every 52 years, two of their sacred calendars, the solar and the ritual, aligned. And that alignment? It wasn't a cause for celebration. It was a deadline. The universe, they believed, had been destroyed before, 4 times already. Each era had its own sun, its own gods, and each time, that world ended. One by wind, one by fire, one by jaguars, one by flood. The age of the fifth sun, our age, was born from sacrifice, and it was only kept alive by fire, not metaphorical fire, actual flame, lit at a specific moment, in a specific way, by priests who walked with the burden of the universe on their backs. When the 52-year cycle came to its end, the entire empire went dark. Fires were extinguished in every home. Cooking ceased. Temples fell silent. Markets closed. The night before the ceremony, nothing burned. People destroyed their furniture, smashed household idols, put out their hearths and waited. No smoke, no warmth, only fear. Because if the gods did not grant fire anew, darkness would reign forever. And then came the climb. A group of priests carrying dry wood and obsidian blades ascended the hill of the star, an ancient volcanic ridge with a clear view of the sky. Below them, thousands held their breath. The priests reached the summit. They prepared the kindling, and as the stars wheeled above, they watched for Orion's belt to rise, their celestial signal. At that exact moment, one man, a warrior, sacrificed for this purpose, was laid upon the stone. His chest was open, his heart, still beating, offered to the gods. And in the hollow of his chest, they lit the first fire, the new fire. If the flame caught, if the gods accepted, cheers erupted below. Drums thundered, tears fell, and if not, they never planned for if not, because that flame was everything. Once it burned, runners were dispatched like sparks through the empire, carrying torches from village to village, temple to temple, reigniting every hearth, every altar, every sacred fire. It was not just about warmth, it was about order. Without fire, the calendar collapsed. Without fire, the gods turned their backs. Without fire, time itself unraveled. So when a family lit their home fire from the flame of the new fire, they weren't just lighting wood. They were anchoring the universe. To burn was to belong. To glow was to be remembered. Even now, archaeologists find charred offerings, bones, wood, fabrics, buried in ceremonial pits. Remnants of a world that feared silence, that knew the dark not as absence but as threat. And you can imagine it, can't you? That hush, that moment between a match and its strike, when the whole world waits for a spark. The Aztecs lived in that moment every 52 years. And every time, they won back the sun. In the vast blue belly of the Pacific Ocean, where the sky meets water in endless embrace, there are islands that burn, not in war, not in memory, but in rage. And at the heart of that fire, in the roaring belly of volcanoes, lives a goddess with hair like lava, eyes like molten stone, and a temper that shapes the world. Her name is Pele. The Hawaiians do not speak her name lightly. They whisper it to the waves. They offer it in chants. Because Pele is not just a deity, she is the land itself. She lives in Halema Uma'u crater, deep within the fiery breath of Kilauea, one of the most active volcanoes on Earth. Her home is a furnace. Her footsteps leave craters. Her moods carve coastlines. According to tradition, Pele was born far to the west, but after fighting with her sister, the goddess of water, she traveled east across the sea in a canoe of fire, searching for a home where her flames could breathe. Island after island rejected her, the earth too wet, the ground too cold, until she reached Hawaii and dug her roots into its volcanic heart. But she didn't come quietly. Number Pele erupts. She destroys to create. She burns to renew. And her gift is both beauty and devastation. Entire villages have vanished under her rivers of fire. Temples swallowed, roads erased. Yet with every explosion, every outburst, new land rises from the sea. It is said that if you disrespect her, take a stone from her mountain, mock her spirit, ignore her signs, she will follow you. In dreams, in misfortunes, in the way your car engine dies without reason. Tourists laugh, locals do not. Because Pele doesn't need temples, she doesn't need statues, she is here, breathing under your feet, roaring in your nightmares, spinning new earth beneath your toes. And when she dances, when lava cascades down her flanks, setting the forest ablaze, filling the ocean with steam and smoke, it is not chaos, it is creation, a fiery lullaby, a reminder that life begins with destruction. Even the traditional Hawaiian chants tell it, Pele's fire is not punishment, it is power. The Hawaiians once held firewalking ceremonies, not to prove strength, but to honor the fire goddess, to show that with the right prayers you could walk her coals unharmed. But that wasn't bravery, that was respect. And respect is what Pele demands. In every volcanic tremor, they say it's her sigh. In every red glow on the horizon, her warning. And yet, she's not cruel. She gives as much as she takes. The lush valleys of Hawaii, born from ash, the fertile soil that feeds the taro and banana, nurtured by her fire, even the black sand beaches, so soft underfoot, so recent they still remember flame, they're her offering. So when you see her mountain smoldering in the night, don't fear, listen. Because Pele doesn't just burn, she builds. And sometimes, the loudest way a goddess can say, I am here, is with fire. The North remembers its dead in flame, not in silence, not in sorrow, but in roaring fire that lights up the fjords like a second sun. For the Vikings, death was not the end. It was a departure, a journey, a crossing into a realm where warriors feasted among the gods. And fire, sacred, wild, untamed fire, was the ship that took them there. When a Viking chieftain died, they didn't bury him in the ground like a secret. They sent him off like a storm. It began with ritual, with reverence, with the gathering of kin, of warriors, of skalds whose voices cracked under the weight of mourning and myth. The dead were dressed in their finest, not for vanity, but for battle. Their weapons were cleaned, their shields polished, their hands placed on their chest as if still holding the line in a shield wall. And then came the offerings, not just coins or trinkets, but entire ships, jewels, chalices, wolves, even, in some cases, the lives of servants or thralls, sacrificed to accompany the chieftain into the afterlife. It sounds cruel now, and it was. But in the Viking mind, to die with your lord was to rise with him in Valhalla. And then, the pyre. Some were burned on land, a wooden tower stacked high with dry logs and wrapped in furs. Others were laid into a longboat, the very vessel that had carried them to war and glory. And that same boat became their final chariot to the gods. They would be rowed out to sea, the ship heavy with the dead and their treasures, and from the shore an archer would raise a torch. This wasn't just any archer. This was often the closest kin, a warrior whose hand could not tremble, whose arrow would not miss, because the flame had to find its mark. It had to strike true. And when it did, when the arrow kissed the ship, a hush fell over the crowd, a hush broken only by the crackle of rising fire, the snapping of ropes, the hissing of water swallowing the heat. The smoke rose into the sky like a beacon, a signal to Odin, a whisper to the Valkyries, another warrior is coming. And as the flames danced, so too did memory. Stories were told, songs were sung. Skalds recited sagas of the dead man's deeds, how he held a pass, how he avenged a brother, how he laughed in the face of axes. Because in Viking belief, a man's name could live forever, if it was carried in fire. Even in the quiet fjords, Where ice clings to pine trees and the nights last months, fire was not just warmth. It was farewell. The body burned. But the soul? The soul rode the smoke, past the clouds, through the 9 realms, to the great hall of Valhalla, where fallen warriors feast and fight and fall and rise again, forever. There, among gods and legends, the dead man takes his seat, and when the fire dies down, what remains is honor, a scorched stone, an empty dock, and silence, the kind of silence that only follows something holy. So if you ever visit the cold coasts of Norway and the wind smells faintly of ash, don't worry, it's not destruction, it's remembrance. Because in the end, the Vikings believed something simple and fierce. To be remembered is to never die. And fire, faithful fire, made that promise real. Power doesn't always roar with swords. Sometimes it drips. It drips from coins clinking in jars, from harvests weighed on trembling scales, from backs bent beneath burdens too old to remember lifting. This is not the history of kings or empires. It is the history of taxes, and the strange, painful, brilliant things humans have surrendered in the name of order or domination. Let's begin in Rome, where you could be taxed not just on your land or grain, but your urine. Yes, urine. In the 1st century AD, Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on public urinals, not as a joke, but as a brilliant fiscal maneuver. Why? Because urine was valuable. It was used by fullers, cloth workers, to bleach fabric, clean togas, and even soften leather. It had ammonia. It had utility. So yes, people paid to collect pee. And when Vespasian's son complained, "Father, isn't it shameful to profit from such filth?" the emperor held a coin to his nose and said, "Does it smell?" That phrase stuck. Even today, in some languages, a profitable but questionable thing is said to have money that doesn't stink. But Rome was just warming up, cross the sea to Aztec lands where the people didn't pay taxes in coins. They paid in cacao. Chocolate was currency. If you wanted to stay in good graces with the empire, you'd better have your quota of beans. And not just any beans, they had to be premium. Imagine paying your rent with fancy chocolate truffles. Only if you failed, the landlord sent soldiers instead of reminders. And it wasn't just cacao. Feathers, honey, woven cloth, all counted. The tribute system was immense, intricate, and enforced by military threat. The Aztecs called it tequitl, and it could break villages. Further east, in ancient China, tax came in the form of grain, particularly rice. For centuries, rice wasn't just food, it was obligation. Every harvest, peasants would separate a portion, not for their family, not for the market, but for the empire. It fed armies, it built palaces, it funded dynasties. In bad years, it broke hearts. During droughts, peasants still had to pay, which often meant handing over their seed rice, the grain reserve to plant next year's crop. It was taxation that devoured the future. And in the high mountains of the Andes, the Inca developed something even more insidious, a tax of labor. They called it mita. It was not about money. It was about time, yours. Each male subject owed the state several months of service per year. You might be sent to work in silver mines, deep, dark tunnels where air was thin and hope thinner, or build roads, temples, and storage houses, many still standing today, still echoing with the footsteps of those who had no choice. This was a tax not paid in coins, but in bones. Families were split. Lands were left fallow. Children waited for fathers who never came back. The Inca called it order. Historians call it genius. But for the people, it was a slow bleed. And what's chilling is this. None of these taxes were evil by design. They were systems, elegant, even efficient. But when the scales tilt, when burden outweighs breadth, systems become shackles, and the empire becomes a monster. In Rome, the people rioted over grain prices. In Aztec lands, resentment brewed under the weight of tribute. In China, entire villages vanished from tax-induced starvation. And in Inca territory, the Mita continued long after the empire fell, inherited by colonizers who liked the system just fine. Because power doesn't invent cruelty, it inherits it, polishes it, renames it policy. So next time you complain about taxes, remember, at least no one's asking for your urine, or your rice, or your labor in a mine at 4,000 meters. Yet, sometimes justice burned, not metaphorically, but literally. In courts of gods and men alike, fire was more than a tool. It was a judge, a witness, and in many ways, a mirror. Ancient civilizations believed the flame had a voice. It crackled truths. It exposed lies. And sometimes, it decided guilt before a word was spoken. Let's return to medieval Europe, where trial by ordeal was not a poetic phrase, but legal procedure. You were accused of a crime, theft, heresy, adultery, and the court, in its mercy, didn't judge you directly. Instead, it handed you over to fire. One common method was the ordeal of the burning iron. You'd be made to carry a red-hot iron bar, barehanded, for a certain number of paces. Then your wounds would be bound. If after 3 days they showed signs of healing, God had spoken, you were innocent. But if they festered, well, God had spoken louder. In this system, truth wasn't what you said. It was what your blisters said. The assumption was brutal and beautiful in its own way. That fire, untamed and holy, would never lie. In other parts of the world, fire wasn't just punishment, it was purification. In Zoroastrianism, fire is sacred, not just a symbol, but a living presence of Asha, truth, order, the divine path. To touch fire was to risk everything. But to be touched by it in ritual, with reverence, was to be cleansed. Even death had to respect the flame. Bodies were not cremated in Zoroastrian rites. That would be polluting the sacred element. Instead, corpses were left atop towers of silence, exposed to vultures, so as not to defile the earth or fire. See the contradiction? The same fire that punishes in one culture is protected in another. The same flame that proves guilt becomes untouchable, divine. Now turn your gaze to India, where the sacred fire of Agni is both God and messenger. To swear an oath by fire was binding not because of law, but because Agni heard you. Break it, and it wasn't just perjury, it was cosmic betrayal. In some traditions, widows were expected to throw themselves into their husband's funeral pyre, a practice called sati. While rare and later outlawed, its symbolic weight was enormous. Fire was the gatekeeper between lives, between honor and disgrace, between memory and erasure. And when fire is the gateway, what happens if it's not used? Let's go back north, one last time, to the fjords of the Vikings, to the land of eternal twilight and roaring flame. We've spoken of their fire-lit funerals, the ships, the arrows, the smoke rising like a soul in flight. But what if the ritual was never completed? What if the body was lost, or denied the flames, or buried without rites? Then the Viking soul might not rest. It might become something else, something feared, a drager, not quite ghost, not quite corpse, but something in between, a restless undead, cursed to wander the world driven by rage, unfinished business, or the simple wrongness of being left behind. These weren't abstract myths. Farmers left tools out at night so the dragger could use them, hoping it would leave their cattle alone. Entire villages whispered about footsteps in empty halls, about graves that refused to stay quiet. Because if the fire didn't carry you, you might walk back. All across cultures, fire marked a boundary between purity and corruption, between truth and falsehood, between this world and whatever waits beyond. And when that fire was denied, twisted, or forgotten, so too was the peace that was promised. So if you ever feel a chill where there should be warmth, or hear a creak in the dark that no wind can explain, maybe it's not a ghost. Maybe it's someone waiting for their fire. Throughout this long and winding journey, from the roaring blood of the Colosseum to the sacred fire rituals of distant lands, from taxes carved into rice fields and mines to souls who never found rest, one thing becomes painfully clear. Power always leaves a trace. Sometimes it's a scream in the sand, sometimes a flicker of flame on the horizon, and sometimes it's silence. The silence of those forgotten, judged, or consumed by systems bigger than themselves. But behind every gladiator, every burning trial, every taxed farmer or sacrificed soul, there was a human, afraid, brave, trapped, or defiant. And perhaps that is our greatest lesson from history, that we are not so different, that fire can warm or destroy, depending on who holds the torch. That justice, when blind, sometimes forgets who's screaming. If these stories meant something to you, even just one name, one image, one moment that stayed, thank you. Thank you for giving your time. Thank you for letting these forgotten voices echo once more. And if you feel like helping this project grow, not for me, but for the stories still waiting to be told, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. Every small action fans the flame, and with your support, we'll keep that flame burning. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Now, breathe. Let the past settle, and when you're ready, we'll light the next fire together.